Hello and welcome to my channel. Here you can expect videos about history and film, mostly in the form of what I'm going to call retrospectives, where I'll look back at a certain topic and provide broad, hopefully engaging and informative overviews of said topic. For my first historical retrospective, I'll be looking at an early disunified Anglo-Saxon England, or the Heptarchy, specifically English history from the initial Anglo-Saxon migrations to unification. In my personal experience with learning history, I find this time period to be relatively under-discussed, just considering how important and fascinating it is. When you think of English history, you think post-William, the Tudors, the Stuarts, the Empire, the 100 Years' War, the Yorks and Lancasters, and don't get me wrong, I love all of those topics and certainly plan on making videos on them in the future, but rarely do I see the era of Anglo-Saxon rule discussed in much detail, and it's a shame because understanding the likes of Ethelbert, Offa, Alfred, Canute, and Ethelred is paramount to understanding the formation of England as a political entity. So the intent of this video is to offer an overview of England during this very consequential and formative era, and I'll soon do a follow-up covering a unified Anglo-Saxon England, ending with the Norman conquest. There is a lot to cover, so if I missed something important, please let me know in the comments. By 84 AD, England, known at the time as the province of Britannia, was firmly in the grasp of the ever-expanding Roman Empire, and would remain that way for nearly 350 years. Putting that into perspective, that's a time period 100 years older than the United States, and covers a span of history practically equivalent to from Oliver Cromwell's Protectorate to modern day. Point is, it's a very long time. But finally in 410 AD, while the empire in the west was severely weakened and gradually collapsing, under the Emperor Honorius, the decision was made to abandon the island. But Roman influence in Britain is profound and undeniable, which should be obvious considering the length of its occupation. Many influences are still very apparent today in the forms of leftover historic structures such as Hadrian's Wall, and even a lot of culture, society, and of course religion. But this video isn't about Roman Britain, it's about the subsequent era. During and after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, waves of Germanic migration were widespread across Europe, England of course being no exception. The main Germanic peoples that would settle in England were the Angles and Saxons from modern-day northern Germany and southern Denmark, as well as to a lesser extent the Frisians from the Low Countries and the Jutes from northern Denmark. Over time, the distinction between these peoples became increasingly irrelevant, which is why the umbrella term Anglo-Saxon is often used. But why did they migrate to begin with? Well, that's somewhat contentious. One very popular theory is that the native Britons of England, after being abandoned by the Romans, were subjugated to raids and invasions from the northern Picts from modern-day Scotland. So they perhaps hired Anglo-Saxon mercenaries, often said to be led by brothers Hengist and Horsa, to assist in repelling the threat from the north. And then afterwards, they for whatever reason chose to stick around, possibly due to a lack of payment from the Britons. Other theories propose that their homelands had poor crop yields, or they were fleeing invasion from other Germanic tribes. But whatever the case, the Anglo-Saxons eventually brought their wives and children and settled in, over time establishing various kingdoms. Generally speaking, the Saxons settled in the south, the Angles settled in the north, and the Jutes also had a couple kingdoms here and there. Immediately, these newly established kingdoms began to contend with their Celtic neighbors, the Britons, which is also an umbrella term and doesn't refer to a specific group, but rather many disunited, indigenous, often Romanized Celtic peoples of pre-Anglo-Saxon England. Wars were fought, and this era of conflict is unfortunately very confusing and uncertain, and also interestingly the context in which the legend of King Arthur is set. It's very likely Arthur never actually existed, but he is said to be based heavily on several Romano-Britannic kings, such as one Ambrosius Aurelianus, who halted Saxon expansion after leading the Britons to a victory in the Battle of Badon. But Anglo-Saxon rule was inevitable, and eventually largely solidified after the Battle of Diorham, where Wessex, led by King Ceolwyn, decisively defeated the Britons and took control of England, while the Britons still remained the dominant presence in Wales, Cornwall, and even Brittany in northwest France. By 600, the major kingdoms of the Anglo-Saxons were firmly established: Wessex, Sussex, Essex, Kent, East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria. Although there were smaller, less significant ones as well, but the aforementioned seven were the most important and predominant, which is why this era is known as the Heptarchy, or Rule of Seven, all contending for dominance over the others. Each kingdom had a king, but the entire Heptarchy had one overlord, which, while it sounds very imposing, didn't possess the same unlimited authority of, say, an emperor, but rather signified influence and prestige over the other kingdoms. The religion of the Anglo-Saxons at this time was pagan, Germanic paganism specific, specifically, which of course very much differed from the Britons and the majority of Europe, who were Christians. But as many know, England and the Anglo-Saxons would be Christianized over time in a very gradual process. The first Christian kingdom of the Heptarchy was Ethelbert of Kent, who was converted and baptized by the very famous missionary Augustine, who would later become the first Archbishop of Canterbury. Ethelbert also happened to be the overlord of the Heptarchy at the time, and so his newfound faith influenced not only his domain of Kent, but the entirety of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Christianity continued to spread throughout England, mostly influenced by the Roman Catholic Church traditions and beliefs, but also to an extent Brittonic Christianity. By 655, with the death of the pagan king Penda of Mercia, all of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had been fully converted to Christianity, well, at least the nobility had. Penda was killed by Northumbrian king Oswiu, and with this victory at the Battle of Winwade, Northumbria had become the dominant force in the Heptarchy, ushering in the Northumbrian Golden Age, famous for its plethora of literature, mostly written within Northumbrian monasteries. Mercia remained a significant power, however, and continued to vie for dominance with Northumbria throughout the 8th century, although it never truly achieved superiority. Under King Ethelbald, however, Mercia did become the dominant force in the south, in an era known as the Mercian supremacy. During the reign of King Offa, Mercia was at the height of its power. He was sort of a Charlemagne light, as he was a contemporary and very much influenced by the Franks. He also had a tremendous and wide-reaching reputation, and his deeds and reforms in some ways laid a foundation for the future of England. Although importantly, Offa's kingdom of Mercia would not serve as the foundation of England, as it would begin to decline following Offa's death. He was succeeded by several weak, short-lived kings, and by 825, the Mercian supremacy was completely ended in the Battle of Ellendon, when King Egbert of Wessex defeated Bjornwulf of Mercia. Wessex was now the dominant kingdom, and would also be the predecessor kingdom of a unified England. In the early 9th century, the Anglo-Saxons were dealing with a new foreign threat, which emerged in 793 during a raid of the monastery at Lindisfarne in Northumbria. I think we all know to what I'm referring. The Vikings, or the Norse, or the Danes, whatever you want to call them, they became a massive and consistent obstacle to Anglo-Saxon progress throughout the Viking Age, and they would also eventually serve as a catalyst for English unification. But that will be the subject for my next video. Thanks for watching. Any feedback is very much appreciated.